Hello. That acronym is QUASA, and it is very challenging, so well done. Awesome. Hi, guys. This is a podium. Can everyone see me over this podium? I'm like a little shorter than the rest of our presenters. I want to give a big thank you to EatDenver. I'm really grateful to be here. You guys are such a good-looking bunch. I'm here today talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is authenticity. It's the best. So I started this project about 5 years ago as part of my master's research. And as a cook and a teacher and a consultant, I hear this word all the time. It comes up, people ignore it, they obfuscate, they don't really want to discuss it. I totally understand. But that wasn't enough for me, and I wanted to dive in. So I started this research with the definition of what authenticity actually is. I wanted to know how people were talking about it. So the first person who really defines authenticity is this philosopher named Theodore Adorno in 1964. And he says authenticity is something not touched by capitalism. And that definition really resonates with how we normally use the word authenticity. It's sort of a close to purity, right? If it's authentic, it's pure, it's traditional. But a definition I really like is by Regina Bendix, who's out of folklore studies, a bit more contemporary. And she says that authenticity is a composite of many derivatives. And I like to think about this when we talk about cuisine. Cuisine is not just one thing, right? Tomatoes come from South America, but we think about them in Italian food, noodles come from Southeast Asia, et cetera. And so when I think about authenticity and ethnic food, I like to think about Regina Bendix's definition and how it's a composite of many derivatives. And so when I dived into this research, I wanted to go to the place where people are talking about this subject the most serious way and with heavy, heavy discourse. And so I turned to Yelp. That was a joke, thank you. And so I read 20,000 Yelp reviews. This hurt me as much as I think it is hurting you to hear about it. I know it is not everybody's favorite site. It is certainly not mine. But I chose Yelp because the platform has 24 million reviews. It is easily accessible. It is widely used. My research focused mostly on New York. That's where I was living at the time. But everyone uses Yelp. And I narrowed down those reviews by choosing the top 10 most popular ethnic cuisines as determined by Zagat. And then I chose 20 restaurants for each of those cuisines, and I chose 100 reviews for each of those restaurants. So this is a quick snapshot of what my data collection looked like. It is hairy, and I won't make you look at this anymore. But what the data actually shows is that 1,400 people in my data set were talking about authenticity, and that is 7% of all reviewers. That's kind of substantial. 7% of all reviewers were using this language. And when I say authenticity language, I do mean using the word authentic. That was 5% of my data. But I also mean synonyms like traditional, like this made me feel like I was in Turks and Caicos, and therefore it was authentic, things like that. So that was 7% of my entire data set. But it's not just about how often we use this language, right? It's also about context. And so what I learned is that people use authenticity language the most when they're talking about Mexican and Chinese food, followed closely by Thai food, Japanese food, and so on and so on. And so I started with the question, what do reviewers gain when talking about authenticity? And what I learned first is that when we talk about authenticity, what we're really talking about is expectations and experience. How closely our experiences match up with our expectations of the restaurant that we're eating at, and vice versa. How closely our expectations match up with our experiences. So there are some good examples of this. This quote reads, "After spending 3 months backpacking through Central America, and what adds up to about 14 months in Mexico, I like to think I know what a good taco tastes like. And dare I say it, the adobado taco at Los Tacos numero uno is what dreams are made of." So this quote clearly demonstrates that this person thinks they have a ton of experience with tacos, and thankfully, their experience matches up with their expectations, everything is aligned, and they're using that authenticity language in this review. So things get a little more complicated, as they are wont to do. This quote: "Service is what you would expect in Chinatown." Now, I'm really hoping that they expect service to be perfect. However, I think we might be able to extrapolate that that is not what they mean. So this is a great example, right, of how expectations and experiences might not always align, unfortunately. And so things are not quite so simple. If we look back at our graph, one of the first things we notice is that Mexican and Chinese food are the two cuisines that have the most mentions of authenticity. And the second thing we notice is that these two cuisines have some of the poorest immigrants in the United States. And here's where things get even more complicated. This language is really racialized. My data shows that we overwhelmingly use more positive language when talking about richer and more wealthy immigrant groups in the United States. And we overwhelmingly use more negative language when we're talking about poorer migrant groups in the United States. So here's an example of a quote. It reads, "Finally, a reliable Chinese place. No filthy windows, grease on your plate, or C rating from the health department." So ultimately, this is a positive review. These people are happy, they're saying, finally, we found it, but the language they're using is really negative. This is not a happy situation. They're using some really negative and hurtful language. In stark contrast is this review that reads, "Most of the servers had French accents. It was so cute." And this contrast really typifies the things I saw in those 20,000 reviews. There's a really big difference in how we use this language to talk about different types of food. So if we look back at my original question, what do reviewers gain when using this language? They gain a couple of things. The first is that this language can legitimize ethnic eating spaces. Spaces that might be new, potentially scary for new eaters. They can sort of put their stamp of approval on something by calling it authentic and make it their own and potentially a little less scary. In turn, that stamp of approval can work to sort of sanitize those spaces. By judging them with their own experiences, there's no real cultural exchange going on, and it proves as sort of a whitewashing, no pun intended. So, as restaurateurs, as cooks, even as eaters, what do we do? What do we do about this? There's a double bind, right? Especially as restaurateurs and as chefs. We have to play into those expectations to some extent. We want reviewers and we want eaters to show up and be excited and be happy and fulfilled with the food that we're cooking, but we don't want to lose that thing that makes our food great, that cultural exchange, what we're trying to give to diners. So I don't have the answers. I wish I did. I'm standing up here on this podium. I wish I could tell you what to do, but I do have some suggestions. And my one suggestion for you is to drive the narrative a little bit and to tell stories about what you're cooking and where it comes from. And I know I still have dreams about tickets piling up, and I don't want to add to your work. And so I will leave you with an example. And that is of Chef David Tu. And he is pretty well known. He was on Top Chef. But he is out of Oakland, where I currently live. And he was trying to sell a $10 banh mi. And everyone lost their mind. A $10 banh mi was unacceptable. Immigrant food shouldn't cost that much. We only want to pay $3 to $5 for our banh mis. It's not authentic. How dare you charge $10 for your banh mi? And so what Chef 2 did is he tried to drive the narrative a little bit. He said, listen, you pay this much for other sandwiches, why wouldn't you pay this much for a banh mi? You pay this much for other full lunches, why wouldn't you pay this much for a banh mi? And he talked to the media, which was some work, but he put some things on his menus and he drove the story a little bit. And by changing those expectations, he worked to change the experience of his diners. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, and thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.